John is a motivated, fun, and outgoing character. He brings energy, fearlessness, and dedication to all his projects. In his latest venture, Coastal Trails Media, he blends passion for adventure and nature with personal growth and finance. He now lives in New Brunswick, but originally from Montreal. I recently found his project online where he went scuba diving near my cottage. So please welcome John on the podcast.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for having me.
So my first question, is kind of how did your latest venture, the Coastal Trails Media, start?
So Coastal Trails Media is a YouTube channel that blends together as you mentioned, my passion for nature and the outdoors and scuba diving, my kind of scientific background, and then also my passion for creative film projects. When you would ask me as a kid what I wanted to do, I always wanted to be an underwater filmmaker, and I wanted to make nature documentaries, which is why I ended up going through the science career path. And with the pandemic and everything that happened, you end up with a lot of time to kind of think and process. And I kindly just decided to pull the trigger, and why not try and make something that is a visual representation of my love for the ocean, as well as giving people a different perspective on how you don't necessarily need to live a fancy, flashy life to live a very happy and fulfilling life.
Yeah, and I like that idea. And similarly, my recent project too is kind of spawned out of this time to ourselves during the pandemic. It's been kind of a good opportunity, I think. In terms of, I guess the project itself, how do you approach growing it, or what's kind of your approach just to the project in general? Are you just trying to have fun with it, or how do you approach it as like a project going forward? And especially with social media now too, I'm interested in how people go about interfacing with that, because obviously it's a big aspect of growing a project, especially online, and especially with the pandemic, there's a lot more people taking in content online. And
I think that's probably for me the hardest part. Simply put, I've never been a very tech person, as we kind of discussed before we got on the podcast. And I've never been a social media person. I don't necessarily like to share the super private moments in my life. But as you mentioned, it's a huge part in promoting what you're doing and getting it out there to the world. And I think when I started the project, I really started it as a way for me to measure my own personal growth. Like that was the original concept. And so I actually have only really started trying to promote it. It's such an important factor. It clashes so much with who I am as a person that it's probably the biggest learning journey throughout the whole process. Making the videos and things of that nature, those are fun things for me, whereas the propagation of it online is the challenge.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going through a similar thing of just how do you reach people online? Because you can even have the content coming out regularly, and I guess that's kind of like the first step, but also how do you get that to reach people? And I mean, you'll see like on Facebook too, once you have a page, they show you like how many people you've reached, and they keep saying you spend this amount of money to reach this many people. And I wonder how hard it become just because of the competition. There's more money getting involved in the space too. So having it easier for someone who has money or like a big brand already to grow even more by putting in a lot of money.
Along that same vein, analytics are super important from everything that I've learned about this so far, not even necessarily applied, but just learned from other people. Yeah, it is an option to just throw a bunch of money at the problem and hope that it goes away and ends up somewhere. One thing that I've come to realize, as I just mentioned, like I've started a new Facebook page and Instagram and all that, the way to go about it, and it's probably the scariest part, is to go through the people that you already have established. You go through your friends and your family who are genuinely interested. They have no idea necessarily of what you're doing or why you're doing it. But as the person putting themselves out there, it's so scary because you're like, all these people are people I care about, and they're going to look at me funny. They're going to think I'm a weirdo. They're going to think, oh, he's such a loser for making these silly, stupid videos on the internet. I mean, even this, right? This spawned from the fact that I was like, you know what? Screw it to a certain extent. I'll put it on Facebook and I'll see what happens. And then you find like-minded people, and then it grows more naturally. I'm very much against, especially as like a smaller content creator, this idea of just pay Facebook to promote your thing. Yeah, maybe. But at what point are you wasting more money that you could be doing something else with than just saying, hey, you've been my friend for X amount of years. Why don't you give this a shot and tell me what you think? You get more positive feedback, or just feedback in general that way too. The people you know aren't afraid to be like, hey, your audio sucks, so you need to get a new mic. Or your last video was a little blurry, like work on your getting things in perspective and sharp. So promoting it, as scary as it is, through your friends, through social media first, is way better than any of these. Pay and get 10 10,000 subscribers.
Yeah, I think that has been my outlook. Like you mentioned, you do get people reaching out, and that's kind of the coolest part of it too, is seeing like-minded people reach out and just getting more in touch with people doing similar things. And so that's kind of the fun part of it, I think.
Even if it's not necessarily doing so, like you and I are kind of cool because we're in the same boat and we think along the same lines, but someone who comes completely out of the woodwork with no concept of what you're doing and shows interest is like, oh, cool. Not only am I doing stuff for people who already like it, but I'm inspiring in a way new people to try new things. And like you said, I definitely think that's probably one of the most rewarding parts of it from an external perspective.
Yeah, and thinking too about that in terms of investment too, like have you put money into the project yet, or how do you approach that side of it?
Especially because the channel in part is based on minimalism and financial literacy and not spending silly amounts of money. I have invested a little bit. I mean, I've bought like a light to properly light especially the videos where I'm just talking more than out adventuring. Luckily enough, most people walk around with a cell phone that has a camera on it that's way better than most DSLRs from 3-4 years ago. Not to mention, you don't need the knowledge to be able to use them properly. There has been an investment in terms of microphones and lighting, and sometimes the actual trips are expenses. As I mentioned in one of my videos, I can't remember exactly which one, and I talk about this a lot with some of my friends. Scuba diving is a huge part of the channel, a huge part of my life, and that is a huge investment up front, but it's not an investment that I necessarily made for the channel. I did it for other reasons, and now it's allowing me to do cool things. And I think that's what I love so much about this project, is that I don't have to dump a bunch of money directly into it, but instead just kind of bring it along for the journey on stuff I would already be doing. That being said, at a certain point you hit a level, and I think that's kind of where I'm going next, where I have a whole bunch of these much bigger ideas planned. I would love to go kind of more cinematic with it. I'm bringing on a friend who will actually kind of help with the filming of it, so I don't have to film and act and edit and do it all on my own. And so at that point, then you're like, okay, maybe I'm going to buy a gimbal thing to help me get some of those cooler shots. Eventually, maybe you get a drone. And I think that that's maybe the way to approach it, especially with video. Don't put in a whole bunch of money until you really figure out what it is you want to do. And then once you start to do that consistently, you can put a little bit more money to take it to the next level, and then a little bit more money to take it to the next level. It's a very step-by-step process where you don't just walk in and dump $3,000-$4,000 on gear and then in a month realize I have no ideas left, so I'm just going to stop. At least with the progression, you never feel like you're too far in to back out.
Because it can be easy to like, okay, I'm really excited about this. I gotta get all the latest gear and do all this. And then, yeah, like you said, you get a few months in and you're like, oh, no, I'm not really into this.
I think it stops a lot of people, right? Because that buddy who gives me feedback about my equipment, while great to have that feedback, it's not always necessarily beneficial to be like, oh, you're going to need this, this, and this. And then all of a sudden you add it all up and it's like $3,000. And you're like, I don't have that money right now. Even if it's $1,000, I don't have that money right now. And so equipment shouldn't be the thing that stops you. The passion and the drive is what should motivate you. And then you fill in the gaps of the things that you need as you go.
In terms of the making of the videos themselves, I wanted to ask you about that because I've seen a few of them and they definitely remind me of that genre of vlogging, talking to the camera. How do you go about actually making your videos, and what sort of inspirations have you had along the way for your videos? And I know for me, I look to a lot of actual like YouTubers that I'm really like impressed by. There's a lot of good content on that platforms. Who do you look to and how do you kind of make your videos?
The process is a very laborious process, but it's a process that I really enjoy. And right now, it's pretty much only me. At the beginning, my girlfriend helped out a little bit. Now she's back at school, so we don't live together anymore. And so I'm setting up the lights, I'm setting up the cameras, I'm writing everything out myself beforehand. You kind of test a bunch of things, make it sure you get it to where you want it to go. Then you record, and then you go in and you actually have to edit it and fill in kind of the B-roll, so the clips that you want to add on top of a dialogue part or something like that. So there are a lot of different steps. The nice thing is I enjoy all of those different steps. In terms of my inspiration, on the channel, there's a couple different types of videos. There's ones that are very information heavy, which are more the kind of the self-development, self-improvement, financial side of it. There isn't a whole lot of extra stuff I have to do. In terms of the vlogging, that's where kind of the more more inspiration comes from. And those are more the journeys or the adventure videos or whatever you want to call them. My original inspiration has to be Bear Grylls. I grew up being an 11-year-old kid who just wanted to go run around in the woods and go on adventures. And here was this guy on TV doing it and being awesome at the same time. Nowadays, spend a lot of time online, you end up watching a lot of people. Vlogging just seemed to make the most sense if I was going to be doing it on my own. Until you have kind of that extra support team to lift you up and do more interesting things with, you have no choice but to hold the camera and talk to it because you're all by yourself. And there's a lot of van lifers, people like that who were living alternative lives that made me go like, oh, I could do something similar to that. It's like minimalism taken to the absolute extreme. They literally buy cargo vans and they deck them out into tiny homes. So they'll have some sort of bed / living room situation and then a kitchenette. Some people even put toilets and showers in this van. So their whole house is on wheels, can go wherever they want. And then they'll work from the road. They can literally never stop journeying and never stop adventuring. That was just something that really resonated with me, going on adventures and journeying, but then also learning to live with the things that you truly need and not spend a bunch of money on things that you kind of want right now that you're going to forget about in a month. So all of those things put together, and I was just like, this is something that I could totally see myself doing one day. I don't know if I'll ever get to that point, but it made me kind of rethink this idea that you have to live in an apartment, work a 9 to 5 until you eventually get married, buy a house, have a dog and a family, and you work till you're 65 and then retire and you're too old to actually do anything. It was part of the beginnings of the financially independent, retire early, the FIRE community and the van life community and all these different groups that were doing parts of the things that I wanted to do that I could kind of combine and create my own little world where I have the best of all of those kind of smaller communities.
When you talk about minimal living, how did that term come about, or how do you see it? Even talking about the van life, I think for me, something I've thought about is just not having more than you really need. And you'll be surprised at like how little you actually need to get by. And for you, what is minimal living? And then does it have any link to other ideas of like the environment, sustainability?
Minimalism to me, or minimal living to me, I think there's a very strong misunderstanding of what minimalism actually is. It's not about living with nothing. Yes, you have the people who take it to the very extreme and own 46 items that all fit in a backpack and that's it. And then you have the opposite side where I saw a newspaper article. It said that a bunch of people in the US don't believe that $400,000 a year is wealthy living, right? Like, so there's two extremes in terms of people. To me, minimalism is about living consciously and knowing what it is that actually brings you happiness and joy and sticking to those things. It's about knowing that I'm going to get more from having all of my dive gear than I will from having nothing. Technically, I could be more of a minimalist and get rid of all of my dive gear and then just rent it every time I wanted to use it. One, that would cost me a fortune. Two, there's this sense of pride in being able to say, like, I own this thing that I truly identify with. Minimalism is about that. It's about figuring out what it is that you actually love and want in your life and holding on to it and then not getting involved with the things that don't matter. In terms of how does that affect other parts in my life, obviously, if you're not going out and buying a bunch of things, you're not spending a bunch of money. So you have more money to put towards the things that you want. And so that's where minimalism ties in very strongly with the financial concept of the financial movement. But more importantly to that is what you alluded to with the sustainability. Consumption is probably one of the number one drivers for climate change and environmental degradation, whether that's through plastic pollution or purchasing a new phone. This is a really good one. Purchasing a new phone every time a new phone comes out. Well, there are some very specific metals used in the production of those phones that require a lot of work to pull out, not to mention carbon emissions, destruction of land. And so if you look at the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, 3 or 4 of them are directly tied to overconsumption. And so from a minimalist perspective, it really goes at minimizing your footprint. The fewer things that you need, the fewer things that you're buying, the less needs to be produced. There's less that needs to be transported around the world, the less that needs to be pulled from the environment. That's probably the part that inspired me to go more minimalistic more than anything else. Just because I'm a big believer in, if we don't protect the planet and we don't protect the environment, It doesn't matter how amazing our life might be, our kids aren't going to necessarily have one. That concept scares the crap out of me. So you give up on some things that you kind of want today to assure that there's a better life for you and your kids later on. And I think sustainability, minimalism, and financial literacy all tie in very well with that idea.
Especially the financial side, I was interested in how it fits in exactly. When you spend money, you're putting value into something that you think is important. So whether it's like for you with the scuba gear, or it's different for different people.
It's a super narrow line to walk because a lot of people see finance and capitalism as this means of generating ridiculous amounts of wealth. For a lot of people, the goal is to get as rich as possible. The problem with that is that it pulls away from the quality of your life, the relationships that you make with people, like you said, the true value you put on things, because it is exactly what you said. When you decide to buy something, you have to start to look at it as, okay, if that thing costs me $300, right? So let's say I'm going to a concert that costs me $300. If you work a minimum wage job and you clear $10 an hour, that means that's 30 hours of work that you are going to spend to go see that concert. If that's a concert you really love, if that was your favorite band or whatever, that might be worth it to you to say, I'm going to work 30 hours at my job to go see this concert. If it's a concert that your friends want you to go to that you really have no interest in and you don't really care about, all of a sudden that 30 hours of work becomes an astronomical price to pay, even though the price stays exactly the same. And so I end up looking at it in time rather than money. I think finance and capitalism and generating wealth is super important because it allows you to develop a foundation on which to build the rest of your life. The only thing you have to consider is how big do you want that foundation to be? And that's where the goal is going to really depend. So if you want to live in a 2-bedroom house, you need a much smaller foundation than if you want to live in a 50-bedroom mansion. It's all about how do I generate enough money to support what it is that I really want to do? And at that point, I consider myself wealthy. So if you want like a concrete example, for me personally, I would love nothing more than to own a small piece of property with a small tiny house on it and live there for free, not owe anything to debt to anyone, not necessarily be worried about having to pay rent or anything like that. When I look at that, especially here in New Brunswick, and that's another part about it in terms of you have to pick where you live based on what it is you want to do. But here in New Brunswick, the price of land is fairly inexpensive because there aren't that many people. And tiny houses, just relative to normal houses, are less expensive because they're much smaller. But you have to be willing to live in a 300 square foot space. I am willing to put in the work and pay the money to get the situation that I want that will make me happy. But I don't necessarily care to make more than that. Another classic thing in finance is people end up staying in too late because they watch that number, the value of that stock or whatever, continue to climb, and they get greedy and they want more and they want more and they want more. And then the next day they wake up and it's crashed and they're down and they regret not selling when they could. The reason that happens is because they have no concept of where they're actually going. They're just watching that number climb. If you knew that like, cool, I need this stock to be worth $100 before I'll sell it because then that will cover whatever, then you just wait till it gets to that point, you sell it, disregard what happens afterwards because you know that you got what you actually needed. That is where the finance aspect of sustainability and minimalism comes into play, where if you understand the foundation of what you're looking for, you can go out and get it and not necessarily need to go beyond that.
Yeah, and that's the thing with finances in general. It just becomes kind of a means to get these things that you want in your life.
It's a means to get somewhere else. It shouldn't be the be all and end all of what you're searching for.
In terms of, maybe some of those things you are able to put money into and adventuring and doing all these exciting, crazy things. Firstly, what draws you to adventure seek or do these things? And how did you get into doing all these challenges and pushing yourself?
I really started getting involved in the more adventurous side or the more risk-taking side or the bigger journey, right? Going on these kind of bigger adventures, not only wanting to learn to dive, but go get my deep dive certification so I can go down to 130 feet or not only learning to rock climb, but potentially how to ice climb, things like that. It's just the next step in the progression. But the truth is it starts with a need to create my own story. Growing up, I didn't really feel like I fit in with the classic groups that you find in high school. I was a pretty good athlete. I played a lot of sports, things of that nature, but it never truly felt liberating. Whereas when I go diving, it's me in my own world living without anyone else's input. And I think that's really what started to push me towards that. And I just loved the concept of, okay, how do you take something that most people would look at and go, that's kind of hard, but I could do that? And how do you push it to the point where people go, you're nuts. Why would you do that? It's because it becomes a challenge of how do I do that? It's crazy, but it can be done. So now I need to figure out a way to get it done. I put up a video a few weeks ago on the channel talking about how do you deal with adversity that comes your way when you're trying to reach a goal. And I overlaid that with some footage of a lot of fire manipulation stunts that I learned and practiced and developed over a couple year period. If you ask any sane person on the planet, why would you want to light yourself on fire? And the truth is because I can, because I figured out how can I take something that is pretty much reserved only for fancy movies and do it super DIY in a way that is safe for me to do. This journey of coming up with concept until you figure out there's a flaw with it and then coming up with a new concept to correct that flaw is so inspiring to me. It's the type of thing that keeps you up at night. You're just like, okay, this would work, but there's that problem. So how do I fix that problem? And then it just builds on itself. That is true creation to me. It's problem solving to the next level done in a way where most people would be like, you're nuts. And it grabs their attention for that. And I think that's why I really started doing it. I wanted to grab people's attention. These are the things you can do when you actually put your mind to it.
Thinking about how you actually execute those or get those done, like most people would just be too scared to do it. And so how do you get over that part? Is it just like a process of one thing at a time and getting more used to it? Or kind of how do you go about tackling one of these big challenges?
One, most of the time I'm scared. Like, let's just get that out there. Like, there's a certain feeling that comes with the fact that you're wearing a hood and you can see an orange glow wrap around the hood. And you know that's because your back is on fire. There's an innate natural fear that comes over you in that moment. But the way you deal with that and the reason why these things are possible is because I've walked through every single step and I understand why these things are physically possible to do. Fear comes from the unknown. It comes from not knowing what's going to happen. It's the same reason why a lot of people won't swim in open bodies of water. Because when you're in the ocean and it's 600 feet down and you can't see diddly squat, your imagination runs wild of all the crazy things that are going to come out and eat you. It's the same idea. We just don't know. But once you've actually worked through the process and put all these steps into place, you start to figure out, well, okay, in the ocean, there's only probably about 10 things that are really going to eat me. And in this area, there's only 3 of those. And normally they hunt in this and this method. So realistically, I'm probably pretty safe. And it's because you know all of those things and you've put in the time to learn the process that all of a sudden that fear goes away to a certain extent.
That aspect of like the open ocean too, like I know kind of like the ultimate challenge of like getting over your fear. So how did approach getting over that, or like how did you take it to the step of even like scuba diving? Or do you think going through that process of scuba diving has like helped you get over that, or helps people get over their fears if you actually face it?
I think that's exactly key. So the reason why I deal with it the way I do is because I started when I was super young. And I think that that's something that not enough people put enough emphasis on. I started diving when I was 15 years old. And when you're 15 years old, you're not scared of anything. I was the youngest person in my class. I had the easiest time because, cool, I'm 30 feet down. The water is 8 degrees. You want me to pull my mask off completely, breathe for 15 seconds, put it back on and clear it? Sure, no problem. Whereas most people picking that seal to let the cold water rush into your face and hit you in the eyeballs is a terrifying process, which is true. It's scary, but at 15, you don't care. I think the key is for most people to face that fear. You have no choice but to put yourself in a scenario where you're going to come out of the other side. Don't climb a building to look down to face your fear of heights. That's a bad idea. But if you can harness yourself up on that building and spend time there and face it, then you start to internalize that feeling and you start to learn how to deal with it. A great example of this is, I can remember it clear as day. I was in the Barbados on a field course when I did my first year at McGill. We, as a group, decided to go out for a night swim where it's just the ocean and you go out and it's nighttime and we're all playing and having a good time. This girl and I decide to swim out to a dock that's maybe 50 feet offshore. So it's not even terribly far, but it's the ocean in the middle of the night. So that like takes it to a whole other thing. And we're swimming back. And all I can remember is turning around and looking straight out into the ocean, like the dark black sky to dark black ocean, and just being so terrified. Because again, you start wondering, what is going to come and eat me? And I forced myself to swim backwards, fixated on the darkness. There's something about being able to come out of that on the other side, having faced it, that makes you feel more confident. 2 years ago, I taught an undergraduate class, Introduction to Environmental Biology at UMB. I made the students do a presentation for one simple reason, because everyone was scared of it. But as scientists, we need to learn how to convey our information and talk in front of people. If they don't learn it now, they're never going to learn it. So you have to just face it, and it sucks and it's scary and it's terrible, but you come out of it on the other side and you go, okay, that wasn't so bad. Next time I'll be a little bit better. So facing it and consistency is really how the majority of people will be able to deal with whatever fear that may be, rational or irrational.
Yeah, it's like this idea of exposure therapy too. Like you expose yourself purposely, like a little bit at a time. And then, yeah, like you said, you get used to the feeling itself. It's not like you're still not going to have that feeling or have that fear in the moment, but you're more comfortable having that and you're used to it, right?
It basically moves you from the position where you're trembling, sick to your stomach and feel like you want to throw up, to a position where you go, okay, this is going to suck, but let's do it. It's that movement. It never takes it away completely, but it makes you feel more comfortable because you know, again, this goes back to what I said before, you know what the end result is going to be. 99.8% of the time, you're going to be completely fine. And so it takes away some of that fear of the unknown because, yeah, you've exposed yourself gradually over time. As I think it's not about going completely exposed the very first time because you'll likely shut down and never, ever want to do it again. It's about doing little bits at a time. And I think that's probably the next part about it, especially when you start doing things that are perceived as potentially more dangerous, is if you do something and you screw it up, you immediately have to do it again. Because if you walk away from that scenario having messed it up the last time, psychologically, you are never going to want to get back on that horse. There's a move in parkour called a Kong where you jump over an object. The goal is to pass your feet through your hands that are rested on the object. A lot of times when people are learning, they clip their feet on the object and end up on their face on the other side. If you do that and don't immediately try again, you are never going to want to Kong that specific object or that group of objects again because it's human nature. Last time something happened, it was really, really bad. Don't want that to happen again. So I'm just not going to put myself in a situation where that's going to happen. Whereas eventually, if you do it enough times, you get enough data points where, okay, 98% of the time I do this, I'm fine. 2% of the time I do this, I screw up, but I'm actually way better at now than I was then. So the probability of me screwing up is so much smaller. And then the fear kind of goes away.
It's a really good point because every part of you in that moment of, okay, I just messed this jump, whatever up is like, oh, I don't want to go through that again necessarily. But by forcing yourself into that and realizing that once you get over that, you'll be fine. Yeah. And during this last question too, you mentioned how you started when you were 15 scuba diving. And I wondered how your craving of adventure and doing all these things has changed over time too. Like, have you gotten into a different place with it? You said, when you're 15, there's not the same amount of fear.
That's a really interesting question because I could answer it two ways. The truth is, when I started diving, as much as I wasn't really scared of anything, there were certain things that I didn't want to do. I didn't necessarily need to go deep diving. In my mind, there was nothing that was going to interest me there. I can enjoy my 45-foot Caribbean, warm water, clear, pretty fish, and that'll be enough for me, right? I can take my videos there, take my pictures, and I'll be a happy camper. But the more you do it, the more you start to realize I'm getting pretty good and I'm pretty comfortable doing these things. What's that next challenge like? What is that deep diver course like? So then you go and you take that and you go, oh, well, this is really cool for a different reason altogether. And then you do that enough times, and not to say it gets old, but you start to crave newness in your journeys and your adventures. And so you move on to maybe an ice diver course or a wreck diver course. So now all of a sudden you're going inside shipwrecks, or you're diving under the ice, and it raises that bar in terms of what is exciting, what is scary, what is novel. And your journey towards ever more risky adventures, or kind of like next level adventures, is a very natural progression. It's so hard for people to imagine, why would anyone ever want to dive under the ice? The water is literally just above freezing. It's cold. It's dark. There's not much to see because everything's frozen. Why would you want to do it? And that's because they've never actually gone underwater before. Once you've been underwater and you've gotten comfortable with the environment, comfortable with the equipment, now all of a sudden you go, okay, well, where do we go from here? Yeah, you can do the same dive 100 times and each one of them is going to be different, but you never get that growth. You never get that progression in your abilities. You just get really, really good at doing one thing, which is fine. But for someone like me, progress is almost the ultimate goal in whatever circumstance that is, whether that's my job, whether that's adventure, whether that's financial situation, like sustainability, minimalism. It's all about progressing. The minute you stop progressing, there's no point in continuing anymore. It's a very natural process where it's like step 4 and 5 don't make sense when you're at step 1, but they make a lot of sense when you're at step 3.
You went diving right near my cottage in New Brunswick. I've always seen people going diving at this certain, so maybe we could just admire New River for a minute, but also like what kind of things do you look for in a dive like that?
New River is an awesome spot just in general. And it's not only for diving. Part of the reason why I love that spot, one, it's super close. It's probably like a 25 minute drive outside the city of St. John. In Montreal, you can't even get off the island in 20 minutes. So New River is like pretty secluded. You do have the dive site, but you also have a hike that's like a 7-ish kilometer loop. So it's super accessible. There's a nice sandy beach right next to it where people have sand building competitions, barbecues. There's a park. So there's lots of options for the whole family, really. It's like a great attraction for the area. In terms of specifically diving in New River, my dive buddy, one of my best friends, actually was part of a project who put a quote unquote artificial reef out there. And so there are these 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot cement cubes that are all linked together, and they were sunk. And so you end up with lots of algae growing on them. You end up with all sorts of different species. You find big lobsters there, a whole bunch of different fish species, lots of crabs, things of that nature. So it's very exciting and novel to go out and see something that your buddy actually put there. That part to me is really cool. The other side of it is the more time you spend, the little bit what I talked about before, the more time you spend doing it, the more it gets old. But at the same time, the more you learn. So a few years ago, we learned that these small squid actually move into the bay late July, and they lay eggs and they hatch. And so throughout August, you can see reef squid in the Bay of Fundy, which is something I always assumed was only a Caribbean thing. And so to be able to do that literally in my backyard, it's awesome. And on top of that, it's a journey because you never actually know if you're going to see them. So it makes you want to spend more time. It makes you want to go a little bit further. It makes you want to wait and see. All of a sudden, you're doing an hour and 20-minute night dive in 20 feet of water, which most people would be like, that's super lame. But that's because you're hanging out with some squid that you never thought were possible in the area that you are. And so like, I love New River for that. It's super accessible, super easy for beginner divers as well. The environment is very easy for them to work with. I can go diving with a friend, and 2 other friends who don't dive can go for a hike, and then we can all meet up for a barbecue at the end.
I also have this vision of like it not being as exciting and plentiful in terms of like what you can find, but maybe you can break that perception.
I've done a lot of diving in a lot of different places. I learned to dive in Montreal. The majority of my dives for a while were all St. Lawrence River dives, predominantly on shipwrecks, with not a lot of life. When you're diving in the St. Lawrence, you're diving to see these old 100-foot boats that are on their side. When you dive in the Caribbean, you dive to go see all the pretty colors. You're diving to see the different corals, the different sponges, fish. When you dive here, it's kind of a weird cross between the two. I've always said St. Lawrence River diving is adventure diving. You're diving to go on a journey. When you dive in the Caribbean, you're diving to relax. When you dive here, you're kind of doing both at the same time. That video that I posted that you referenced, there you get to see, I think it's like 4 or 5 or 6 different species. And that was all done within an hour. So imagine if you extrapolate that, if you're doing 5 or 10 dives in that spot, how many different things you're going to see. Part of what's exciting, I think, for me in particular, is because I actually know what I'm looking at. A lot of people will go like, oh, that's a fish. That's another fish. Those two things are completely different fishes. But to the majority of people, a crab is a crab, a lobster is a lobster. They don't necessarily know that a green crab is an invasive species that's actually super harmful for the area. Whereas the rock crab that's holding another rock crab is not because he's eating the other one, it's because they're actually mating. And so like when you actually understand the biology, it's not just about looking at a fish. It's about looking at what the fish is doing. Why is the fish in this area, in this habitat at this time of day, or interacting with this or that? A few weeks ago, we actually went on a night dive. It was super cool. We actually ended up coming up and there was a lot of bioluminescence in the bay, which is, again, something I never thought I was going to see here. You literally run your hand through the water and there'd be a 1.5-foot trail of light in a pitch black ocean. It was insane. But that same dive, we actually saw juvenile lobster out on a mud flat hunting shrimp, which 1, juvenile lobster are largely thought not to really wander out. 2, they're not really thought to be on a mud flat. And 3, they're definitely not considered to be feeding on the mud flat. So in that 50-minute dive or hour, 10-minute dive, whatever it was, we kind of like broke 3 unspoken rules of science. And so there's a certain aspect of that, of diving the same place, like I said, where the more you go, the more you see, the more you know, the more you actually enjoy it. That's why I love diving so much, specifically diving here.
How did your love of nature start and how has it evolved and how do you think it's informed your ideas of sustainability?
I loved animals and being outdoors my entire life. Part of me goes, I loved the camping and the adventuring and the being outdoors aspect from the fact that like I grew up as part of the Scouts and the Cub movement. So I did beavers, cubs, and a little bit of Scouts. And my dad was the leader. For me, it was just more time to spend with my dad. And that's all I really wanted to do. The more we did that and the more we went on camping trips and stuff like that, I started to really enjoy being outdoors. And my grandparents owned a cottage in the Eastern Townships where we would go. And as I got older, I started to branch out on my own and explore. My grandparents had this beautiful cottage with nice, warm, cozy beds. And I would literally build brush shelters out back and sleep in the dirt in a sleeping bag because I could. I remember my grandfather just being like, what are you trying to prove? Like, who are you trying? And I was like, no one. I just really enjoy doing it. So eventually I ended up interacting more and more with animals and I wanted to be a vet for the longest time. And eventually I was on a vacation. There was a big storm and it blew a bunch of jellyfish into pools along the beach. And my dad told me like, you can't put the jellyfish back because the tide's just going to blow them back up and they're going to die anyway. So I put them in a bucket and I carried them back to the campsite with us. And then I carried them back to the beach the next day and I released them. And like, that was the moment that my love for nature, or for at least the underwater world, really took off. In terms of how it affects my my views on sustainability, it's probably the number one reason. Family might be number 1/number 2, but it's this idea that I love it so much. I want my kids to be able to enjoy it as much as I'm enjoying it. And so I need to do whatever I can to protect it. And that's why not so long ago, I switched to a predominantly plant-based diet, moving away from the majority of animal products. I don't eat meat at all anymore. And it's just because, like we kind of alluded to before, consumerism and agricultural practices are 2 of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, habitat loss, pollution, global warming, or climate change, whatever you want to call it. The simple fact that I would hate life without that natural world to be able to go and explore in means that I will give up all of the luxuries of modern society to make sure that I can keep that intact for as long as humanly possible. And it goes along with the idea of tiny houses and even van life, being able to live off grid, live off of renewable energies, potentially have greenhouses, grow a bulk of your own food. When you are more aware of what you're using, you tend to use a lot less. Perfect example is water, especially here in Canada. We are super lucky to have so much water, but we also waste so much water. But if you're actually collecting rainwater and that's the only water you have to cook with, drink, wash your dishes, wash yourself, clean whatever you need to clean, all of a sudden that water becomes way more precious because you know you only have two 55-gallon drums in the back and that's it. And so I think a lot of it all ties into the sustainability, which comes from the love of nature. I want to avoid a lot of consumerism, only buy what's necessary, live a minimalistic life, live to a certain extent in an area being very aware of what I'm using, live off-grid, live on renewable energy.
Yeah, and thinking about how you actually made that choice or made that move to New Brunswick. You said you were from Montreal originally, and then was that wanting to be closer with nature part of that move too? And how did you deal with making that move?
I don't know if it was necessarily part of the original move. It was definitely part of the reason why I stayed. And I think that is more important. Coming to New Brunswick was an opportunity to work with somebody who was very well respected in her field, and it was a great experience for me to go in terms of my career. It made a lot of sense from a career perspective. The goal was to go and really start living my adult life and start building that life. No longer be a kid, no longer live at home with your parents, like go out, strike out on your own. But it was when I really started to embrace what the province had to offer, which is where I fell in love with it. As I mentioned, you drive 20 minutes and you can't get out of the city of Montreal, like regardless of where you are. Here, within 20 minutes, I can go to New River and go diving. I can go to the Kingston Peninsula and go rock climbing. I can go to Wellsford and climb a mountain, or go see some awesome waterfalls and swim in a pool under the waterfall. And so for anyone who appreciates the thing in life that I appreciate, this is a gold mine. You couple that with the fact that there's half as many people in the entire province than there are on the island of Montreal alone. Why would you ever want to go back? I don't have to deal with traffic. I don't have to deal with long lines. I don't ever have to really reserve a restaurant beforehand. And every weekend I can literally be out at a new spot doing something completely different. Why would I ever want to give that up?
Yeah, and I guess you're saying you reached a certain point though when you realized that, but what were some of the challenges or hurdles before that, dealing with moving to a new province, a new city, a new everything?
It's a super challenging thing to do because I was the first one to ever leave Montreal. I moved to a new province in a new city where I didn't know a single person. The nice thing when you do it for your undergrad is you get thrust into a situation where most people are from out of province or out of the city. And so you end up with a lot of people who don't know people. And so you get to mingle with those people because they're also looking for people to mingle with. When you move from a big city to a city like St. John for your master's, all of a sudden you're in one class. There's 9 people and 6 of those people are from St. John or from New Brunswick. And so they already have their groups of friends and like their life. So now you're trying to like inject yourself into pods that are already protected. And so I think that was the biggest challenge, transplanting myself into this position and then going from the person who would organize friend get-togethers, barbecues, soccer games, where you'd have like 25 people in my backyard just hanging out and then going to throw a football around, to the person who literally didn't know anybody and was like craving that social interaction. I don't know if I have an answer to how do you do it better than I did. But I think it really comes down to, like most other things, and you kind of just have to try. I eventually met up with one friend. We met at a climbing gym, which I would go to by myself because I didn't know anyone. Eventually we started talking. We started climbing outdoors. We became very close friends. In another way, I met my dive buddy through work. So we ended up diving for the university together. But eventually I just had to send him a message and be like, hey, I saw you posted some dive pictures. Do you want to go diving? And he's like, yeah, sure. And then now I go to his house pretty much every other weekend and eat dinner with his family. And then the last one is, don't be afraid to be yourself. Like, I know it's super generic advice, but I think it's really, really true, because probably my closest group of friends that I have here now, I met because I wore a wrestling shirt to class one day. I literally walked in with a wrestling shirt and someone went, hey, I know that guy. You watch wrestling? And I was like, yeah. He's like, me and some friends watch wrestling. There's a show next Sunday. Why don't you come by? Now we're like super close friends. To most people, they wouldn't be caught dead in a public situation with something as weird as a wrestling t-shirt. But for me, it was a great opportunity to externally show to people what I'm all about. And it doesn't have to be wrestling. It can be video games, or it could be acting, or it could be like, wear a cool movie t-shirt and people know like, oh, cool, he's into at least that movie. And all of a sudden it gives you something to talk about. It breaks the ice without even having to say anything. For someone who's looking to reach like-minded people in an actual social way, not through the internet. It's basically a billboard saying, this is what I'm into. If you're into it, come talk to me. But yeah, it's super hard to uproot your life and move somewhere else. And there's definitely a lot of challenges, but you kind of have no choice if you're really doing it because you want to do it, right? It's providing you with something else in your life. You'll find other ways to make do with whatever bad situations you're dealing with.
Again, kind of thinking more of maybe some of those challenges, or maybe some of those days where it's a bit harder than others. And I'm just thinking of your vlogs too, even, and how you kind of bring this energy and presence to the camera. And how do you get to that spot though? Are there some days where it's not working out, or how do you get back into that mind space of positivity and kind of energy?
To a certain extent, it is a little bit about lifting yourself up even when you don't feel like it. So there are days, completely transparent, completely honest here, there are days when I really just don't want to film, so I don't film. It's the nice part about doing it more as a creative side project, at least for now, than putting all my eggs in that basket, is that if there's a Monday night where I had a rough day at work and I don't want to film, I don't have to. The other nice thing about the videos that I make, and I think this speaks a lot to people who go online, be like, oh, this specific type of channel is doing really well, so I'm just going to copy what they're doing. But they're not really invested in it. They don't really care about it. And so they end up in a situation a month, 2, 3 months down the line where they're just really over it and they don't want to, and they can't lift themselves back up. Because I love to do what I do and I'm just bringing the camera along, it becomes a lot easier because it's not about, oh, I'm going to go make a video. It's about, oh, I'm going to go rock climbing, or I'm going to go climb this mountain, or I'm going to go diving, or I'm going to go do parkour in the park. So I'm not trying to convince myself of, oh, I have to go film this specific thing. It's that I'm going to go do this thing I like to do and bring the camera along. And then you get excited when we do things like this and I talk to like-minded people. I get excited because I can see they get excited and we feed off of each other's energy. And it's harder to do that with the camera, but you have to feed off kind of that internal energy where you're generating it yourself just by getting excited about either what you're doing or the next thing you're doing. One of the things I talk a lot about in the channel is the concept of progressions and progress. And we've talked about that a lot already in the podcast. But when you look at it, everything builds on itself. Every video comes out as tied into at least one other one. So a perfect example is I've never been a huge bike person. I used to bike all the time, but I never did like mountain biking or downhill mountain biking or even speed biking, anything like that. But I was talking to a friend. There's a specific mountain here that's like really long. It's like a 17-kilometer journey one way. So it's like a 35 kilometer day, which is really big. And so we were like, well, why don't we try biking the first part of it until it gets too steep and then we'll just hike the rest. And so now all of a sudden I get this like, okay, well, I have to go out and bike because I want to get good enough to be able to do that thing that sounds really exciting to me. And so I'm building myself up and I'm providing myself with that energy, not only about, oh, I should go do something cool right now, but if I do that cool thing and get good enough at it, I can do this other thing that's super cool. And I think that's where truly having a passion for what it is that you're doing is what is going to make sure that you can do that long term rather than just give up or like get over it.
I thought about this even yesterday of how maybe even having the camera there makes you more, it kind of holds you accountable too. And like you realize, okay, I'm doing this because I really have a passion for it and it's going to help me capture that.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think it's almost more inspiring when I see myself screw up. I am very driven to be good at the things that I want to be good at, that when I don't think I'm doing good, it pushes me to want to get better. And so if I am ever filming and I realize like, I wasn't feeling it that day, my energy wasn't high enough, it's lackluster, right? It's not bad video per se, but it's also not an exciting and engaging video. And clearly that's what I want. So next time I got to do better. And so, yeah, it does like remotivate you to be like, no, I'm better than this, so I can do better than this. So you re-inspire yourself and reinvigorate yourself to go out and do better next time.
I always like to end it off with thinking about or asking you like how you approach the future. What's next for you?
I'm really hoping to get more into a creative and cinematic part where it becomes not only about what it is that I'm doing, but how am I portraying that activity to someone. I think the fundamental core of the idea is never going to change. I want to help people build the life that they want to live and get them to realize that they don't need to be earning $150,000 a year. They don't need to be living in the big cities, in the penthouse apartments. true satisfaction is knowing what you want and figuring out a way of achieving it. That is never going to change, but my approach to it can be a little bit more developed and refined. It goes along with what I've been saying from the beginning. It's about progress. So I'm never happy with what it is I am doing right now, but I want to get to that point where I go to the bigger and better next step. There are some things in my personal life where I'm hoping to potentially change up my living situation to go more along those sustainable tiny house off-grid lifestyle and embrace that a lot more. I'd love to do more of this because I had a blast on the podcast, and I think I just really want to promote and grow the channel. I would love to do longer environmental documentaries, BBC style nature documentaries, where it'd be so cool to document the entire arrival to egg laying to propagation of the squid in the Bay of Fundy, just because that's not something that most people are even aware of.
Ending off the show, where should people look to find all your different projects?
I think the easiest way is definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel, so Coastal Trails Media, or you can like us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, and I have an Instagram. So depending on what kind of information you want, if you want more behind the scenes, go check out the Instagram.
Thanks again for agreeing to come on this. It was fun.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to the next time we can do something similar.
All right, John. Thank you.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much.